Welcome to Grow Money Business, the podcast dedicated to helping business owners grow both their wealth and business on their own terms. Here's your host, Grant Bledsoe.
Hello, everybody. Grant Bledsoe here. Welcome back to Grow Money Business. This week on the podcast, we're talking about Amazon. Our guest is Steve Anderson, who has gone through a very interesting process of reading every single investor letter written by Jeff Bezos to investors in Amazon, dating all the way back to 1997 when the company went public. He's read through them all, scrutinized them, and distilled them all down into 14 different business principles that led to Amazon's success and that we can apply in our businesses and probably as investors for evaluating potential investments. Steve joins us to summarize what he's found, which he's also done in his book called The Bezos Letters. We had a great conversation. He's categorized each of these 14 principles into 4 distinct categories. We talk about them in detail, what his thoughts on the company are and what's driven the growth, and what we can pull from that as we manage businesses ourselves. This is a great conversation. I encourage everyone to go out and purchase Steve's book and read it if you're halfway interested in the episode today. Hey, everybody. Real quick before we jump into today's episode, I have been advised by my attorneys to remind you all that none of what you might hear in today or any other episode of Grow Money Business is financial, investing, tax, legal, fitness, or even relationship advice. It's content that you're free to use and deploy on your own terms. And before you take any actions on what we might cover in the show, I really encourage you to consult with your accountant, attorney, or financial planner. If you don't have a financial planner and think that you might need one, be sure to check out threeoakswealth.com to learn more about my firm's planning, advice, and investment services. And we're live. My guest on the podcast this week is Steve Anderson. Steve, welcome to the show and thanks for being on.
Oh, Grant, thank you so much for having me and look forward to our conversation.
Me too. I am really excited because you've done something that's unique and I think really, really cool. And what that is you've read all of the letters to investors that were written by Jeff Bezos to Amazon's investors and deconstructed them and pulled out the business and growth principles that they used, that Jeff and his colleagues used to grow Amazon over the years. Could you give us a 30,000-foot view summary of what you found when you reviewed all of those letters?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. And, part of what's really interesting, caught my attention, I guess is probably the best way to say it, is Bezos really did leave, as I call it, hidden in plain sight, the tools, techniques, principles that were either part of him or he developed during his time building Amazon. I distilled all of those letters into 14 principles, and I grouped them into 4 cycles that I believe any business goes through, and frankly, maybe even for bigger businesses, any department or group. The cycles are test, build, accelerate, and scale. And the 14 principles fit into those 4 different cycles, obviously maybe different points along a business growth strategy. And the other thing I always like to remind people is, when I talk to business owners today, they think Amazon, I'm not an Amazon. And I would tell them it's unlikely you're going to become an Amazon. But that doesn't mean that you can't learn from what Bezos did in your own business. And I also like to remind people that Jeff Bezos literally started out in his garage on his hands and knees, taking books, putting them in packages and driving them to the post office, just like every other new business owner. Now, obviously, he's done something to build Amazon to what it is today. And that's what really kind of intrigued me. What were those things? And can you translate them into your own business?
Yeah. So remind us what the 4 were again. Test, build,
accelerate, and scale.
Test, build, accelerate, and scale. So could we maybe go just chronologically a little bit through the life cycle of Amazon? I'm kind of a linear thinker, so it helps me personally to go chronologically. I don't know intimately the details of Jeff Bezos's background, but I know he was at a hedge fund. I think it was D.E. Shaw prior to launching Amazon. Is that right?
That is correct. Yeah. He graduated from Princeton, went to New York, was at D.E. Shaw for several years, and was doing research there on this new thing. So this was, mid 90s, right? If you remember back, the internet was a new thing. And he was researching the internet and kind of what implications it might have, et cetera. And he came across this statistic that internet usage was growing at 2,300% per year. And what he said was, that doesn't happen very often. And I wonder what kind of business you could have that would take advantage of that kind of exponential growth. And literally came up with this idea, actually created a list of about 20 products he thought you could sell on the internet. And again, this is before people knew that was even a thing. Today, it's like, of course you can. Back then, it wasn't. And of those 20, books was at the top, primarily because books are the same, whether it's a Barnes & Noble in California or one here in Nashville. A book is a book. And so there was no distinguishing factor there. But what the internet allowed Bezos to do was create a million copy bookshelf, whereas a Barnes & Noble, or at the time a Borders, were limited on the inventory they could carry, but Bezos wasn't. And so he could literally have any book and every book published available for sale. So that was where he started, but he always had in mind expanding that out. It was never just books. That's just where he started.
Right. And so it was a calculated decision to start with books because that was the most
easiest to get going, right?
Yeah,
Basically.
yeah. Okay.
And he moved to Seattle because two of the biggest book distributors were within an easy driving distance from the Seattle area. And so when people ordered a book, he started carrying some inventory, but he actually would go and pick up the books at the distribution center and then bring them back, package them, and mail them off. So again, all of those, kind of beginning factors. Now, obviously today they have millions and millions of products in inventory and their fulfillment center and everything that was built. But that's where it started and why it started in Seattle.
Interesting. So how did he get users initially, right off the bat? So he has a great job. He has a Princeton degree, so a really great job, and an idea based on this concept that internet usage is growing at 2,300% per year. So he moves to Seattle to start this platform, starts with books. He's close to the distribution center so he can get the books. How does he get the buyers?
Well, what's interesting is at the beginning and really throughout up until maybe 5-10 years ago, Amazon did very little advertising. What Bezos believed, and it's a core principle of growth, is that customer service is a key, and he relied on word of mouth advertising, meaning book people would find they could get books online. They would talk to other book people. They would go to the Amazon.com site. And the principle that I had and that Amazon has is called customer obsession. And that's in the build cycle. But obsession was always a really interesting term to me because you don't often hear it when you talk about customers. You hear about customer support, customer experience, customer journey, those kinds of terms. But obsession takes it a bit further. And in his very first 97 letter, so they went public in 1997, wrote his first letter. And in there, he laid out what Amazon would be doing. And one of those would be focusing obsessively on the customer. And he believed very strongly that that word of mouth would build it. And it did show that it did build it as more and more people heard about Amazon and went there to get things they couldn't get anyplace else. So yeah, to me, it's really fascinating that advertising actually was not a big part of the early days of Amazon. And he did some experimenting with advertising, but frankly couldn't see the results that made it worthwhile versus building a platform with the best customer experience available online. I mean, even to the point of, um, and today, again, it seems so obvious, but at the time when people bought online, they had to enter all of their information every time they bought, every time they went to check out. And so they created a process that customers could store their delivery information, their credit card information online. And it was so unique at the time that Amazon actually received a patent called one click buying and held that patent until 2017. So again, it's a combination of technology, removing friction out of the customer experience, so obsessive customer experience, and being able to capture some of that stuff and figure out, okay, what are the things that customers really want that make a difference? And all those things, again, led more and more people to experiment or try out this new site called Amazon.com.
Interesting. So I have a couple questions surrounding all this. The number. So Amazon went public in 97.
Mm-hmm.
When was it launched?
95. Well, he started working on it in 94. It was actually launched in July 1995.
Wow. So 2 years between launch and going public is
correct.
Incredible.
And again, think about back then, going public was not kind of what it is today in terms of IPOs and doing all these different kinds of things. And going public for him was very strategic in terms of getting the money funding he needed to continue to grow. And so Amazon Bezos plowed all profits back into building infrastructure for years. And now they still don't have dividends. They don't pay out money that way. Now, obviously, their stock price and all those kinds of things is what the return for investors get. But all of that initial money was plowed back into fulfillment centers, delivery network, and even new initiatives in the early 2000s. Prime, 2-day shipping, unheard of. Again, why? Because if it's better for the customer, it will be better for Amazon and our shareholders over time. And that's another principle, is long-term thinking. He thought from the very beginning in terms of decades, not just quarters. And that 97 letter, he very explicitly states that we will focus on long-term decisions, not short-term Wall Street expectations. And he was, what's the right word? Pummeled for that position. I mean, and he sort of single-handedly changed that mindset at Wall Street, that quarterly profits are the thing. And he didn't care because he was focused on the long term. He knew it was going to take a long time to build the infrastructure necessary to build a strong foundation for Amazon to continue to grow.
Yeah. Pummeled was the right word. I mean, if you think of the first 10 years of stock performance, if you go back and look at the chart, it's awful. I mean, they lost a lot of money in the first 10 years. And of all the things they pioneered, that one is a really big one.
Yes.
Because at that point, every single public company lived and died by the quarterly earnings call with Wall Street analysts.
Correct.
You have this call where you report your earnings, you talk about what's going on in the business, but there's no long-term thinking. It's every 3 months, rain or shine. Nobody had flexibility at that point to execute any long-term strategy.
And I call Bezos perhaps the most counterintuitive business person I've ever heard of or known, meaning that's counterintuitive. Focus on the long term. I don't care what Wall Street says. And again, fast forward, 28 years now, and sort of has been proved out the fact that long-term thinking and building out that infrastructure now pays tremendous dividends to Amazon in terms of stock pricing and profitability and all those kinds of things.
Yeah. So I'd like to backtrack just a touch. 14 principles you've pulled out of these investor letters, categorized into 4 different areas. And you made a comment at the beginning of our discussion today that you were a little bit unsure whether these principles were something that Bezos acquired along the way and kind of came to, or whether they were maybe innate that he had all along. What is your sense of where he falls on the spectrum? I mean, as a research analyst at D.E. Shaw, you're looking at a whole bunch of different data. I'm sure it was shaped by his experience there, at least partially, right? I mean, what are your
Absolutely.
thoughts?
Yeah, no question about it. And I think it's a combination. I think and I kind of go back to that original 1997 letter. And here's what's interesting about that letter. Every single letter since that he has written, he always says and always includes a copy of that original letter. Because, and then now Andy Jassy just did his 2021 letter, just published a few weeks ago. He also attached that original 97 letter. And what he said was the principles in that letter still apply today. So again, think about that long-term thinking. And I mean, I have not interviewed him. I have not met him. If I ever get that opportunity, my questions are going to be, how did you think of this stuff? So let me go back to your original question. I think it's a combination of his experience and before, meaning growing up as a kid. One of the really important impacts on his life was from age probably 5 or 6 till like 16, mid-teens. He spent every summer at his grandfather's ranch in Texas, and in the middle of nowhere. And his grandfather was one of the original directors of, at the time called ARPA, now called DARPA, which is the Defense Department Advanced Research Center, I guess, something close to that. And I can just imagine those conversations with his grandfather as he was out helping mending fences. And he talks about that in some interviews where he said, we had to be self-sufficient. We couldn't just run to the store because it was an hour away or whatever it was. And I think he learned a lot in terms of, okay, how do you do it yourself? So I would say some of it's innate, just part of his life experience up to that point. And some of it he learned as he was building Amazon, what worked, what didn't work. And I could give you lots of examples of, again, very counterintuitive things that they do at Amazon even today that most businesses would not even consider doing. And I believe it's a big reason why Amazon continues to invent completely new things that nobody's thought of before. So there's a reason why that happens at Amazon.
I want to dive into that. Absolutely. And I had a follow-up question to that, and I just lost it.
I hate it when that
As a
happens.
podcast show host, I should probably not allow that to happen.
Yeah, it'll come back. Don't worry.
So why is that? How are they able to continue to come up with these great ideas?
I think there's several things. One is, and it kind of goes back to that first cycle called test. And the very first principle is what I call encourage successful failure. Meaning, and again, a short version of the story of where that phrase came from. Like Bezos, by the way, I have been fascinated with space my entire life. He has also. Part of the whole reason Alexa is there is because he was trying to duplicate the replicator computer on Star Trek, which has done pretty well. So
yeah, not bad. So Amazon's gotten all its ideas from Star Trek, is what you're saying?
Well, I would certainly a lot of them. I would say not all of them, but a lot of them. So the Apollo program, again, I'll try and do this short because it's a longer story. Apollo 1 was the first Apollo, right? So we had Mercury, Gemini on our trek to go to the moon. Apollo 1 had the 3 astronauts were doing a fully live test prior to launch. In that test, they were in the capsule on top of Saturn V rocket, 100% oxygen atmosphere, and an electrical spark ignited that oxygen. All three astronauts were gone within a couple of minutes. And it was a tragedy that literally shook NASA to its core. They didn't even know if they could get to the moon at that point. Fast forward to July 1969, Neil Armstrong, lands on the moon. Apollo 11, Apollo 12 went back, Apollo 13. Now, when I say Apollo 13, that probably brings back some kind of memory, right? Meaning 56 hours after launch, there was a explosion of a oxygen tank in the service module, and it all of a sudden became, Houston, we have a problem. And then everything became, how do we get these three astronauts back alive? If it wasn't for Apollo 1 disaster, it might not have been, NASA might not have been able, and there are several people, again, have been quoted about that. But in the movie Apollo 13, Ron Howard's movie, Tom Hanks is playing Jim Lovell, the commander of that Apollo 13 mission. They landed successfully, everybody alive. He's stepping off the helicopter in the movie on the deck of the Iwo Jima, and he narrates that our mission, Apollo 13, became known as NASA's most successful failure. Failure meaning they didn't get to the moon. Success meaning they got all three astronauts back alive. And one of so great story maybe, but what does that have to do? Well, Bezos says several times in his shareholder letters, Amazon is the best place in the world for an employee to fail, because employees are encouraged to experiment. And if you're going to experiment, by its very nature, you have to expect failure. Because if it's not going to fail, if you know it's going to work, it's not an experiment. And so this is where I believe businesses in general today have gotten things backward. They talk about needing to innovate. I don't think they need to innovate. I think they need to experiment and invent, which actually allows them to innovate. And so without the invention part, and again, if you look at Amazon's history, what have they done? They've invented entirely new types of businesses over and over and over again. New products, new services, new platforms, partly because they're willing to experiment, they're willing to suffer failures, knowing that one big bet will more than pay for all the failures that took place before it.
Right, right. It does seem like a lot of the tech companies, the major tech corporations, are getting better at that concept, though. I mean, Google,
I think that's
it's
true.
just part of their ethos. They give people, a few hours a week just to explore whatever the heck they want, right?
Yep.
But that's an excellent point. Now, the 14 principles that you mentioned that Bezos attached that original letter in 97 to each one of his subsequent letters, as did the new CEO when he started producing these. Were all 14 principles present in the original letter, or did they kind of evolve? Really?
So one of the things,
really?
So again, as we were crafting the book, one of the things we asked is exactly that question. So I've got these principles that I think are part of what he talks about. Where do they show up? And so literally in the book, there is a section where we reprint the 1997 letter and we highlight everywhere where the 14 principles show up in that letter. And then we took, at that time, the last letter, the 2018 letter, and did the same thing. So again, I believe these principles are actual principles, that they flow through what Amazon has been able to accomplish. And actually, we're in the process of working on a second edition, because now for Bezos, the 2019 and the 2020 letter have been published. The 2020 was his last letter as CEO. So we're kind of thinking that'll wrap the book up. And then Andy Jassy took over as CEO, and the 2021 letter, like I said, he just published.
Interesting. So let's dive into each of these four categories a little bit deeper. We talked about testing, right? We need to be not so much innovative, but just check out new things, experiment, be encouraged to fail. There needs to be that culture and that that needs to be fundamental to the company, which sounds like it is.
Yep.
What next?
Build is second. And that's where we talk about obsessive customer service, or obsess over customers is the actual principle. And I talk about apply long-term thinking. And then the third principle there is understand your flywheel. And that's another really interesting one. More than likely, in fact, I have it right here. More than likely, people have this on their bookshelf somewhere. Jim Collins.
I've got it right here. Check this out.
There you go.
Right there.
Yeah.
Nice.
So if you turn to chapter 8, the title is called The Flywheel and the Doom Loop. So Jim Collins, that book was published in October of 2001. In August of 2001, Bezos invited Jim Collins to an all-day off-site senior leadership team meeting. And they spent the day talking about the flywheel. And that they came out of that meeting literally with a napkin, sketched on it Amazon's flywheel. And so a flywheel, if you're not familiar with the term, is mechanical. It's the huge, big wheel, heavy, hard to get going. But once you get momentum going, it just kind of keeps going. And so the concept Collins put in his book is that there are inputs in your business that if you get them right, will get your flywheel turning and will continue to push the business forward, help the business continue to grow. And for Amazon, the core of that flywheel was growth. What does it take to grow? And then the inputs were a bit back of what we talked earlier, having a website experience that was superior to anything else people could do. And again, think about this in early 2000s, right? And again, websites were new, not always great, but Amazon spent billions of dollars making it easy to buy things online. And so when you make things easy by the simple fact that people talk about it, brings more people in. Now, so that's one input, right? Making it easy, more customers. When you have more customers, you have more price negotiation with manufacturers or suppliers of the products that you're putting on there, so you can lower the prices. Lowering the prices brings back more people that have a great experience that they talk about, so that flywheel keeps turning. And then in early 2000, they added Amazon Marketplace. And again, that was the third iteration of trying to get third-party sellers on the Amazon website. Now, again, let me stop here a second. Absolutely crazy counterintuitive thought to allow a competitor to actually access your product page and display their product. But here's what Bezos said. If a third-party seller has inventory and we don't, it's better for the customer. If a third-party seller has a better price than we're able to get, it's better for the customer. And again, feeding that flywheel, right? Better for the customer, people are going to come back. And 3 customer pillars at Amazon. If I can remember them, hang on a second. I'm back to your, kind of question. So first is low prices, wide selection, and fast delivery. And he says in one of his letters, we can't imagine a time our customer will want higher prices, less selection, and slower delivery. And so those are 3 pillars still today that push Amazon forward. And now, again, Prime is 1 day, maybe 1 hour, depending on where you live. Faster delivery, again, wide selection, the everything store, and that continues to grow. Their third-party sellers continue to grow. And here's what's somewhat brilliant. All of that money invested early on in infrastructure, those third-party sellers now store their product at Amazon fulfillment centers. They're eligible for Prime delivery. The third-party sellers pays a fee to Amazon for that service so they don't have to do it themselves. That's another revenue source for them. So again, it's all these pieces working. So that's the flywheel. And it's interesting because of the principles, I think that one is maybe the most important and probably the hardest to actually implement. It's just people don't think in terms of the flywheel and how does that affect their business. And Amazon's flywheel is not going to be another business's flywheel, right? A luxury goods provider isn't necessarily going to push for low prices. They're going to push for something else. But what is that, and do you understand it?
Yeah, yeah. And you think about, I mean, I think about things through the lens of investment opportunity because that's what I do every day. And competitive moat is a really important subject. You know, how replicable is your product or service? Do you have intellectual property rights over it or whatever? And that flywheel that you just described is a huge part of your competitive moat because, as you put it, it's really heavy and really hard to get started, but it adds a lot of momentum over time and it's hard to replicate by somebody else.
Well, and I mean, look at Walmart trying to
Yeah,
compete against Amazon. They're trying to
exactly.
do a third-party marketplace. They're trying to do two-day delivery. They're trying to do, but they're almost too far behind. Maybe not, and Amazon's certainly, what's the right word? Competition certainly affects them and also pushes them, right? So they continue to get better. Do they have that enough of a lead, or is it getting chipped away? And that's a longer discussion on how they respond to that. But absolutely, that's why that logistic and that early investment, it's really hard to build out that network. I mean, the Amazon logistics network is massive, and it's takes huge amount of money, and they've spent it over the years, but it's definitely a competitive moat for them in terms of, and again, they build it out. Every new product they put through it, the marginal cost is lower and lower because they've got the infrastructure already built. So the more they put through it, the more they're able to spread out that cost of that infrastructure.
Right, right. Which probably brings us to the next phase, right? Which is accelerate before
Accelerate.
scale, right?
Yep.
So you've tested, you've you've thrown a bunch of stuff at the wall, figured out what sticks. You've built around those successful experiments, and now
And now you
you
accelerate the growth.
accelerate the throughput, right, through the
Correct.
system that you've built. So
And,
tell
and
us more about that.
yeah, and I'll pick a couple, maybe my favorites. One of the principles in the accelerate is to generate high velocity decisions. And this we mentioned a little earlier, counterintuitive. This is one of the areas. So Bezos spends the 2015 letter pretty much all talking about the decision-making process at Amazon. And he calls it high velocity decisions. And he describes decisions as two different types. The first type are big bet the farm, kill the company if we do it wrong decisions. He calls them type one, and he calls them one-way doors. So if we go through that door, if we make that decision, it's really hard to change it. And, maybe picking their second headquarters, right, might have been one of those types of decisions. He said the second type, however, are more easily reversible and don't kill the business if you make a wrong decision. And he said the problem is when companies grow, accelerate, they tend to move to a more bureaucratic decision-making process. So they take type 2 decisions that should be made rapidly with not nearly enough information by the lowest group, meaning hierarchically, that is capable of making the decision because they can be changed. What does it matter if they make a wrong decision? Now, it's not quite as willy-nilly as that. The other, type 1, need to be lots of information, slow, and probably ultimately your gut is going to tell you which is the right way to go. But he says, once you move type 2 decisions into a type 1 process, think about bigger organizations as bureaucracy builds, as you got to, pitch it to the supervisor. The supervisor pitches it to the district manager. The district manager pitches it to the regional. You can already feel the decision process slowing down. And when the decision process slows down, growth slows. At Amazon, they work very hard at keeping their decision making fast and pushing it down to the lowest group that can make that decision. And again, understanding that the vast majority of decisions made in business are typically reversible, or they don't cost you that much, and you can pivot and move from there. Now, let me go ahead and ask your question. I'll pause.
No. Go on. You're on a roll. This is great.
One of the tools they use, again, back to that counterintuitive, is in 2004, Jeff Bezos sent an email around to the senior leadership team. Now, the senior leadership team ebbs and flows over the years. It's probably 10, 15 people that are the top executives in Amazon, and they do make final decisions on some of those big decisions. The email said, PowerPoint is banned from any meeting from this point on. What? So any slide-oriented presentation will no longer be made. And what he put in place instead, what was originally called a 6-page memo, now it's called working backward documents. But the idea here is, if you're pitching an idea and need a decision, it's too easy to hide behind bullet points. And so he required people, the person bringing the idea, the decision, what needed to happen next to that meeting, he required them to physically write a memo. And it could be no longer than 6 pages. It had to start with a future press release. Let's say they're pitching Echo and Alexa. The press release had to state when the product was released, what's the benefit to the customer? What's that press release going to say of why this product is something that people should pay attention to?
And can I interrupt just shortly?
Yes.
And when you say pitching, you mean somebody with an idea to build this Alexa product, right?
Correct.
We need to spend corporate resources on this: time, money, energy, staffing, all that stuff. But we need acceptance throughout the group. And so rather than pitch it through a PowerPoint, you need to create this 6-page memo starting with the press release.
Correct.
Not pitch it to customers.
Correct. You do extensive customer research, right? You intimately understand your customer and what they wants and desires are. Second part of that memo is a FAQ. What are all the questions they think people are going to ask? Now, here's what's counterintuitive. That memo is not sent out before the meeting. It's passed out at the meeting. And the first, depending on how big the decision is, 10, 15, maybe 30 minutes is literally spent, everybody who is in that meeting reading the memo, making notes in the side, questions they might have, or information wasn't covered or whatever. And then it's open for discussion. And so
why is deliberately not passing it out until the meeting begins? How does that aid in the decision-making process?
Because Bezos says executives are busy and they lie. They say they've read it or are going to read it before the meeting, and they don't. So let's just carve out time, homework, homeroom, study hall, whatever you want to call it. And literally everybody in the meeting then at that point is on the same page. And there have been a couple of employees who have described the process and love it, because now they're not getting interrupted. Oh, I'm going to get to that in the 2 slides down. Wait a minute. That everybody's got all the information they need. Now they can talk about the substance of the decision. What about this data? What about this? Have you thought about this? Do we need, what resources all of those kinds of things become a discussion point. Really interesting, really hard for an existing organization to start buying into this idea. And I believe it is definitely one of Amazon's secret sauces of how they do that. And it's the whole idea of slowing down to speed up, meaning it takes longer, right? It's easy to throw a PowerPoint together with some ideas, but if you have to write it down, that's what I do when I write articles and think. I'm figuring out what I think, right, in the article and edits and those kinds of things. I'd rather do that before the meeting than at the meeting, and that's what Bezos discovered. In fact, in the application process at Amazon, one of the things that they say in terms of how to prepare is you may be asked to do a writing assignment, because writing is really important at Amazon to make sure people think through deeply what it is they're pitching, proposing, what are next steps, et cetera. And kind of in today's world of, instant this and that, it's really interesting that they would take a position that writing things down improves and accelerates the decision-making process.
Interesting. Those are totally. Now we talked about, a focus on experimentation as opposed to innovation. Those concepts are rather innovative, and I'm sure it was scary banning PowerPoint presentations. I mean,
a lot of pushback. Yeah, a lot of pushback.
You gotta have some guts.
Well, and then there started to be kind of parameters around it. So people would do, their quote memo wasn't originally 6 pages, but they kept, then it got to be 30 pages, which was crazy. So then they put a 6-page limit on it. And then they said, you can't use 8-point type. Right? I mean, I'll think about
you work around the rules a little bit.
Yeah, I mean,
no margins.
Exactly. And so kind of over time, they realized what worked and what didn't work to make that purposeful, I guess. So, and that is a standard practice today in terms of how they are able, one, to move so fast, and two, and Andy Jassy talks about this when he's talking about the 6-page narrative. He said, too often programmers come up with an idea and then they just go start programming. And then when they release it, nobody wants it. And I'll tell you, one of Amazon's biggest failures, I believe, was their Fire phone. Now, most people don't even remember that Amazon had a phone. 2014, and this was Bezos' pet project, which is, I think, interesting. But he wanted Amazon to have a phone. And basically, they created a phone, and it basically was to make it a bit easier to shop on Amazon on a phone. Well, utter failure. Announced it in early 2014. At one point, they dropped the price to 99 cents. They couldn't give it away. And at the end of 2014, they wrote off $178 million in inventory and development costs. So kind of back to my first principle, right? Successful failure. Where's the success out of that? Well, the same group that built the phone, it's called Lab 126. It's their hardware. That's where the Kindle came out of. 4 months after Bezos announced the phone, he got his first demonstration for a cylinder that could sit on a counter and people could talk to. What we now know as Alexa, the machine learning, and Echo, the hardware that recognizes people's voice. And again, technically very complicated. I'm always amazed I can stand across my kitchen and talk to Alexa and it understands me. I mean, that's called, far voice recognition, technically very difficult. The machine learning, voice recognition, all of that whole ecosystem, they learned from the phone and were able to take that, what they learned, and put it into now what's arguably one of the more successful products that Amazon has created.
Yeah. That's fascinating. Although I will say my wife has a friend named Alexis, and every time she comes over, if they're in the kitchen, it's a big problem.
So
they haven't figured that part out yet.
Well, here's what I can tell you: you can change the wake word.
Oh, okay.
So because I told you earlier, I do like space stuff. So one of the wake words you can change it to, it's on the app. And the wake word I use is computer.
Oh, so it's like Star Trek. Yeah.
It's like Star Trek. Yeah,
Nice.
exactly.
Nice. Okay.
And where do you think that might have come from? Bezos might have had a little input on adding that wake word, but
Probably so. Probably so. So test, build, accelerate. And accelerate, we're adding more throughput to the system that we've built. We have multiple levers to speed decision making, type 1, type 2 decisions. Type 2 decisions are pushed down to the bottom rung that's capable of making that because it's a reversible, less permanent kind of thing. And we are
yeah. One other
structuring our
quick one.
meetings and getting rid of
One other
PowerPoint.
quick
Sure.
one in the accelerate is what I call make complexity simple. And there are multiple examples of that. That again, that phrase came to me few years. I don't remember how long ago now when Amazon bought PillPack, which was a pharmacy, and the stock of Walgreens, Rite Aid, CVS dropped like 20% the day that was announced. And I remember listening, probably NPR, to an interview with one of the CEOs of one of those companies. And he said, well, we're not worried about Amazon. He said, the pharmacy business is more complex than they realize. And I literally said out loud in my car, but that's what Amazon does, is they make complexity simple. Think about the Kindle. Now, again, we're used to it, right? But think about what you can do with a Kindle. You can be reading on your Kindle device, go to your iPad later, and pick up reading exactly where you left off. That's called Whisper Sync. And technically very difficult because that Kindle device, you could have left it sitting there for a week or two. And Amazon needs to recognize that was the last point on the Kindle device and bring you to that same point or ask you, do you want to go to that same point where you left off reading? That's making complexity simple. And again, with grocery shopping, with all kinds of different things, that is a primary focus of what they do. So anyway, that's just another one in that accelerate that I think is.
So let's move on to scale then.
Okay.
What do you, I think of, well, before this conversation, I used to think of accelerate and scale as somewhat similar, often overlapping. How do you think of them as?
I think that's probably not, I think that could be accurate. Yes. I think scale is, so one of the principles in the scale cycle is maintain your culture. So we've talked about a number of unique things about Amazon that's part of their culture. Amazon has grown to 1.3 million employees worldwide. How do you maintain your culture? How do you maintain hiring the best people? And that's another principle, which is focus on high standards. Amazon doesn't lower its standards for new employees, even as hard as it can be for them to find people right now. So those are, in the scale area, may be different than accelerating your growth. It's how do you manage that growth, right? Accelerating is how do we ramp it up? Scaling is how do we manage that and keep the core of who we are as a company? And that's part of that scale. And the final principle 14, again, I already said I had a favorite, but maybe one of my favorites. I tell people when people ask me, okay, which of the principles are the best? And my typical response is, well, that's like asking me which of my 7 grandchildren I love best, right? They're all different. They're all unique.
You have one, but you can't tell them, is what you're saying.
Well, I can't be recorded saying it. But the 14th principle is believe it's always day one. And again, what's really counterintuitive when you think about Amazon and where they are today versus where they were in 94, 95, 96, is Amazon still thinks of themselves as a startup. And interesting, Mark Cuban, investor, owner of the Dallas Mavericks, right? He owns a lot of Amazon stock. And what he said was, Amazon is the best startup I know. And people don't think about Amazon now because of where they are and how big they are. But think about that. And so in 2017, Bezos was at a all hands meeting, several thousand employees in Seattle, all in a theater together, standing there with some note cards of questions that people had submitted to him. And he looks down and reads the question and kind of chuckles a little bit. And he said, the question is, Jeff, what does day 2 look like? And he kind of pauses and he says, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. And he said, day 2 is stasis, followed by irrelevance, followed by painful, excruciating decline, followed by death. And that's why it's always day 1. And everybody broke out in applause, right. But this idea of it's still day 1, it's always day 1, again, comes from that original 97 letter where he said it's day 1 for the internet and for Amazon.com if we execute well. And his 2016 letter went into that question and his response. And one of the things he said was, what I'm more interested in is how do you fend off day 2? We have to do that here at Amazon. How do we keep that startup mindset? Every time we walk into the door in the morning, are we thinking about what's best for the customers? Are we thinking about the startup excitement that you have when you're first starting a business? And he says he identifies several items that he thinks are what he called a starter pack of day 1 defense. Obsessive customer focus. We talked about that. A skeptical view of proxies. So for Bezos, a proxy is a standard, a procedure, a process that you need. So he acknowledges they're not bad, but they can become bad if you rely on the procedure instead of the outcome. Meaning, are we serving the customer, or are we saying, well, we follow the procedure?
Right. Kind of this is the way we've always done it.
Exactly. Yeah. So he said a skeptical view of proxies. You need them. And one of the things he did there a long time ago is he actually published his email address in one of his letters, jeff@amazon.com. And when he started, he would review those emails. Now a team does it. It's still valid. But what they're looking for is anecdotal information. If a customer is saying there's a problem in an area and he's getting a few emails about it, he's going to question, what are we missing? The data may tell us something, but anecdotal information you can't ignore and shouldn't ignore. Even if the data is saying something, are we sure the data is giving us the right information? And so that's one way he handles that, or at least tries to pay attention to that. The third is eager adoption of external trends. So again, looking at the technology arena, what's out there? Machine learning certainly is a big external trend now. What other trends in your business are you paying attention to or eagerly adopting, beginning that experimental process of figuring out how do we adapt to something? And Seth Godin, excuse me, a Seth Godin quote I really like, and I can't exactly quote it, but basically he says, the question about technology always is, how does this help our business? When he says, in fact, the correct question is, how does this technology destroy our business model and require us or enable us to build a new one? And when you look back at companies that are day 2 companies or became day 2 companies, like a Kodak, like a Sears, like a Blockbuster, like a BlackBerry, like a Borders, right? I think that was not even paying attention to, eagerly adopting those external trends. And then believe it's always day 1. So, the fourth one is high velocity decision making. So Those are the 4 defenses to moving into that process of becoming a day two company.
Right, right. Do you own Amazon stock?
I don't.
You don't? Have you ever?
No, I haven't.
Really?
Yeah.
Because what a lot of this whole process is a lot of what an investment analyst would go through on the qualitative side of evaluating whether it's a good investment or not. What are your why haven't you purchased it after doing all this research? You have a lot of positive things to say about the company.
I do have a lot of positive things. Part of it was just I don't have a good answer to that, actually, Grant. And I think now with the stock price, they're 20-to-1 stock split, get down low enough that that I may jump in a little bit here. It certainly has been interesting over the last number, and I have charts in the book of the stock price and what it's done, and number of employees and what it's done, and some of that kind of information. But it's definitely a good question that I don't have a great answer to. I just never, quote, got around to it, which is probably, the inertia that's never a good answer for why you didn't do something before. It's like I was going to buy $20 of Bitcoin like 5 years ago. Why didn't I do that? Because, I'd never got around to it, unfortunately.
It is a common issue. It's a very
Yes.
common issue. So how did you get the idea to do this? What is your background, and why'd you go through this whole exercise? It's a lot of work. I mean, it's worked out phenomenally for you, but
it is a
holy
lot of
smokes.
work. Yeah. So briefly, my background is the insurance industry, both selling insurance early in my career. In the last 25 years, I focused on technology for insurance agents. How can they use it in their operation? And kind of through that, I've served on several industry, work groups, and just thinking about how fast technology is changing and how people are having a hard time keeping up and adapting. And this idea came to me that the biggest risk businesses face today is not taking enough risk. And that kind of started leading me into, okay, so if that's true, what companies have not taken the risk and gone, and I mentioned a few of them. Those are sort of easy to find, and certainly the big ones are more well known, but a lot of small companies too, go out of business because they're not willing to keep up to take the risk. And when I came across Amazon, I just was fascinated with Amazon as a company, but more importantly, when I started reading the shareholders' letters, I was like, wow, Bezos actually laid out, hidden in plain sight, his plan to grow Amazon. Now, I say hidden, it's sometimes pretty well hidden, but I sat down and read all the letters that were available as a narrative, as a single book, if you want to say. And they were about, 50,000 words. So that's a decent business book. And my first step that led to the book was to create a one-page summary of each of the letters. Executive summary, here's some key points, here's some key metrics about Amazon, key quotes that I thought, and I was going to give it away PDF, as a lead gen for my business, basically, to that I thought agents might be interested in learning more about. Fortunately, my wife, who's my co-author, has been in the book business for 30 years, and showed it to her, talked to her about it, and she said, and we had been talking about, because she's in the business, about me doing a book and maybe pivoting to a little wider audience than my micro niche of insurance agents. And she said, "This is your book." And I was like, really? Huh. So that's when we began. It was probably an 18-month journey in terms of kind of that point to me working on, okay, what would this look like more fleshed out, to the book being published in the fall of 2019. And of course, we know what happened in the spring of 2020. Everything shut down. So
People stayed at home and read a lot of books, right?
They did. Yes, they certainly did. And we're fortunate that, kind of as you've alluded to, the topic interests people, and it's really had global impact. It's been translated into 18 different languages, published around the world, and as much a surprise to me as anybody else. But it is gratifying to know the book and what I was able to extract out of it. and kind of for me, the positioning has been, I know a lot about risk, and in insurance, we do everything to help people avoid that risk, right? Or if they have an accident, bring them back to the same financial position they were in prior to that accident. Well, the risk businesses face today aren't always just financial. And I feel like Bezos is the master of risk because of how he uses it strategically to grow Amazon. So that was the lens that I looked at everything through. That's definitely different and unique from others.
Yeah, yeah. Well, congratulations on all the success of the book. It's a super interesting topic for me as an investment person, but also, these four concepts that we talked, these four core concepts that we talked about today are relevant to any business in any industry, no matter what you're doing. And it's always a really helpful reminder that's clearly worked pretty well for Amazon over the years. So
Yep.
kudos to you for doing that work and stepping out on a limb to write the book. Where can people buy it if they want to go out and read it?
Certainly available on Amazon, and probably not in a local bookstore, but they certainly can order it. And for more information, you can go to thebezosletters.com, and there's more information available there about the book and different things that I've done around. You can see all the different book covers from different languages and stuff, which is always fun for me to see.
And the name of the book again is
The Bezos Letters.
The Bezos Letters by Steve Anderson.
14 Principles to Grow Your Business Like Amazon.
14 Principles to Grow Your Business Like Amazon. And social media, where can people follow you? Do you have anything else?
Probably the best place. I'm not on Facebook much, but I'm very active on LinkedIn. So okay. You'll certainly find me there.
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much, Steve, for spending a little time with us and sharing a lot of the substance of the book, some of the substance. If people are interested, please go out and buy the book and read it, because this is a really cool concept that I think is relevant and beneficial to anybody running any size business from time to time. So thanks again, Steve. I really appreciate your time.
Grant, my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for tuning in to Grow Money Business, the podcast dedicated to helping business owners grow both their wealth and business on their own terms. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Google Play, or wherever you digest podcasts to ensure you don't miss out on future episodes and announcements. And feel free to submit questions to growmoneybusiness.com.